We now know many school districts will be returning on time this fall and in person, but we're still learning what exactly it's going to look like in the classroom. How will students do social distancing, and will they have to wear a mask? Well, I talked with Greenwood Middle School Assistant Principal Jennifer Brinker about that for this week's edition of Schools in Session.
A lot of the measures are just common sense, more frequent cleanings, making sure that we're limiting like water fountain areas being used and things like that, providing alternatives there. But, really social distancing whenever possible. Cafeterias are a big one to look out for. So you will find a lot of students eating their lunch in their classrooms. If not, they might be, spaced out in the cafeteria, eating in some alternative places, different schedules. We've looked at alternating times that kids are going to be out in the hallways during passing periods for the older kiddos. We just make sure that we're limiting the number of visitors in the building, doing, Google Meets maybe instead of face-to-face parent-teacher conferences.
What about busing? I know a lot of parents have wanted to know, what does that look like? Because normally you'd have 65 kids on a school bus. How do you do social distancing that way?
Guidelines came out and they were great, but very hard to follow as far as I think it was something like 14 kids on a bus. So what I'm hearing and seeing most districts are saying is they're asking parents if they possibly can provide transportation for their child to do so. But we also know that that's not realistic for a lot of families. So that's going to mean more frequent cleaning and sanitizing on the buses, probably assigned seats, and then the use of masks is really a great way to protect your child during that time.
Yeah, and speaking of masks, I wanted to ask you about that. Is that something that's going to be encouraged or required, or are you still talking about that?
That depends on the district. Most of what I'm hearing is that they are strongly suggested and sometimes required, meaning if you're working in closer proximity, a place that's harder to social distance, then they might be required at that time. And that's what most local health officials that have been meeting with leadership teams have suggested as the best way to prevent it. And I want parents to keep in mind that, I've heard some people say, well, it's not comfortable for my child, or we're willing to take the risk. It's not just about your child. We care about them, but we have staff members that are at risk. We have maybe students with intense medical needs, so we have a responsibility to them as well.
But what if I'm a parent and I'm saying, you know what, I appreciate all the work that you've gone through to do this, but I'm still not comfortable sending my son or daughter to school?
Right. We know that we have families in that situation, and even though it's not required, I'm hearing that most districts are going to provide an alternative to maybe be able to do school online virtually in the fall if the families need that. And that's going to mean a lot of work on teachers and schools as to what that's going to look like. So that's a big chunk of what's happening with those plans right now.
What happens if there is a confirmed case at your school?
That becomes a health department issue more than just a school issue. So what I've heard is that, at that point, the school would let their local health department know about that. They follow up, and that's when we have to just take the advice for what we need to do. And that can look, from what I've heard, depending on how many different people that kid has come into contact with, from just minimal exclusion for quarantining for that student or a smaller group to a whole district being shut down. So we'll just have to take our advice from the health department on that.
Thank you for all of your work and the work of your fellow administrators and teachers getting ready for an unprecedented school year, Mrs. Brinker. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.